Hi, Bill.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on this.
Oh, well, welcome to it. You hail from the blog Liberal Oasis.
That's correct.
And I guess that name is some kind of comment on the geography of the blogosphere, is it? I mean, it implies some sort of vast expanse of arid land.
Well, the original idea for it was, that at the time, it was June 2002, just the idea came to me to call something liberaloasis.com. I couldn't believe that the URL was even available. So once I bought it, I said to myself, what can I do with this? And I tried to make an entire portal of liberal links. So if you're looking for anything liberal on the web, this would be the first place you'd go to.
I see. So if only Liberal Desert had been available, is that what it would be called?
There actually is a blog called Liberal Desert out in Arizona.
Okay, well, I won't go there. Literally, I won't go there. Now, you're also the author of a book that's going to be published in a week or two called Wait, Don't Move to Canada. And it's funny you should mention that, because there actually have been a couple of times during the Bush presidency when I've said to my wife, you know, living in a country run by this guy is so unpleasant and or embarrassing that it's tempting to think about actually moving to another country, you know, like, for example, when he was talking to Tony Blair while stuffing that dinner roll in his mouth. But then you realize one thing he's accomplished is to make it so that pretty much any country you move to, you would be hated for being an American.
Well,
so that's really not a viable option.
One argument I make in the book is that if everybody moved to Canada, then the neocons would just eventually invade it anyway. So what's the point?
Yeah. So you wind up under the same regime.
Exactly. But it's a joke that a lot of liberals make, which is why hopefully it's an engaging title. But it's actually not something that a lot of liberals do. You might have heard some stories after the 2004 election that there was a big spike in traffic at the Canadian immigration website, which is not only true, but there's almost no follow-through. In fact, I checked with the Canadian Immigration Department to get the stats, and the numbers are so negligible as to be almost nil.
So you have quashed that myth.
There were about 4,900 total people that immigrated to Canada from the U.S. in 2004. That number rose to a whopping 5,400 people in 2005. And there are 60 million liberals in the country.
Now, is this in the book?
Those stats, I got those stats after the book went to press.
So only on Blogging Heads TV will people get that.
That is correct.
And their incentive to buy the book will remain uncompromised, because that's not in the book. So that's perfect. Now, in the book, one thing you insist is that we should stand by the L word, right?
That is chapter 1.
The word, we should call ourselves liberals.
Unquestionably. And it's one of the big mistakes that has been made over the past 15 years. I mean, there definitely was a move away from liberals, starting with the George McGovern landslide loss. Jimmy Carter in 1980, ran against Ted Kennedy by calling him too liberal. Mondale stayed away from it. Dukakis stayed away from it. Until the very, very end of the 88 race, actually. It was a last-ditch Hail Mary for Dukakis to call himself a liberal, which actually raised his poll standing after that. Obviously not enough to win. But soon after that, the House liberals organized themselves in a caucus, and they did not call themselves the Liberal Caucus. They called themselves the Progressive Caucus. And that, to me, was really the nail in the coffin.
Now, does the word progressive in itself bother you, or is it just that it signifies retreat?
The latter. I mean, if I was starting off with the language and I had to come up with the word, I might very well have gravitated to progressive.
Right.
There's a lot of inherent positive
attributes. It has some
to
nice properties.
Absolutely. But liberal and conservative are embedded in the lexicon now. Those are the parameters of debate. Whether you call yourself a liberal or not, the media will and the right will. And so if they're using that terminology and you're not, you are sending out a signal that there is something wrong with it and it's worth running away from, and you're allowing conservatives to use it as an all-purpose slur, and that's what's happened in the last 10 years.
But I mean, well, first of all, I mean, I think in your book you say that, a very small number of Americans actually identify themselves as liberals, right? Like 20% or something?
Well, it is about 20%, but conservatives about 33%, so neither side is a whopping majority.
What about negative feelings toward the two labels? Do you know what the numbers are there?
I would assume they probably are quite high. I think liberal right now, in particular, has a horrible stigma attached to it. I mean, and the plurality of Americans call themselves moderates, about 40 to 45%.
Well, I mean, it just seems to me then that it's kind of an uphill battle. To call yourself a liberal in a country where most people have associate negative things with that is kind of tying a weight around your ankle or something.
I think it's absolutely an uphill battle, and I wouldn't recommend fighting an uphill battle unless I thought it was necessary, because when you put forth an idea, any sort of policy idea, it is going to get put into that category, whether you like it or not.
You think so? I mean, so you can't, a candidate couldn't just come along and say, look, I'm a moderate. That's what you should call me.
A lot try.
Clinton, what did Clinton call himself?
Well, Clinton, defined the whole third way concept, and so there are a lot of folks out there that feel, well, like Clinton said third way, it worked, he's the winner, do what the winner did, but that ignores that Mondale, Dukakis, Kerry, Gore all tried the same thing also, and Gore won, I would point out. But it's not in and of itself a recipe for success. There are other factors in '92 that allowed Clinton to win, one being massive disappointment with the current incumbent, and also his personal charisma. And the difference between 2 terms of Clinton and 2 terms of Reagan is that when Reagan left office, who was an unabashed conservative, he left a ideological legacy with his party that still guides and roots their principles to this day. And I think the constant repeating of basic principles builds a level of trust with the public. Even folks who don't call themselves conservative, there's a level of comfort with, I know where those guys are trying to take me towards. Even if I don't agree with them all the time, I at least have that sense from them. With the other side right now, I don't know what that sense is.
Now, is yours a minority position on the left now? I mean, progressive has really kind of come into currency, right? Is that like... And in the netroots, is progressive almost the official term now? I mean, what do they say on Daily Kos, for example?
I think actually on Kos and the other big blogs, it's almost interchangeable, and I think
they use both proudly.
They use both proudly, but there are folks like me who are still engaged in this debate. I know the folks like David Sirota and Paul Wadman, who's over at Media Matters. I know they push progressive very hard. So there is a little bit of a debate going on, and I'm not a big fan of language debates, quite frankly. And I think there are a lot of liberals that tend to get mired down in that. I mean, I'm not an English major. I'm not terribly eloquent or anything, so it's not where my intent focus is. But I think this particular label is so crucial because everything flows from it, and so much of political discourse flows from it. And if you're not defending it and defining it, someone else is going to do it for you, and it's going to keep us on the defensive, going forward.
Okay. I mean, the other one other minor thing that bothers me a little about liberal is the sheer ambiguity. I mean, in the 19th century, it meant something more like what conservative means today. I mean, kind of laissez-faire economics and very little regulation, and some of that usage is still current. I mean, and sometimes it just gets downright confusing.
Well, something that the right has been trying to do is there's almost like an additional phase of the liberal project on their part. Part of it is just to beat it and bludgeon it to a bloody pulp, and so no self-respecting person could use it. I think in 2004 there was another phase to affix flip-flopper to liberal, to almost say that liberals are so awful they can't even be honest with you about what they're all about. There arguably is a third phase of that, which is defining what they like to call a classic liberal or a decent liberal, and to basically say, Joe Lieberman's a decent liberal. He's liberal, but he's not a big wimp that's going to let the Islamo-fascists rule our country. And the indecent liberals are those awful folks like Move On and Michael Moore, etc. And in doing so, I think they hope to essentially corner the parameters of quote-unquote decent debate. And that might be part of what is continuing a level of murkiness with what liberal means today, and why I think it's so incumbent upon those of us who are actual liberals to define on our own terms. Okay.
Well, speaking of Islamo-fascists, why don't I talk a little about the liberal challenge or progressive challenge or whatever of framing a foreign policy, which you talk about a little in your book. I gather the book is more about domestic policy than foreign policy, and I've only seen fragments of it, but there is a chapter that deals with foreign policy, right?
That's correct. I mean, there's about, I'd say, 6 or 7 chapters that are really about policy and ideology, and maybe in the last 3 that are more about grassroots tactics. And so I have one dedicated chapter to foreign policy, which, quite frankly, I might argue is the most important chapter in the whole book, especially with what's going on today. So I wouldn't want to say just because there's one chapter, it's somehow demeaned in my eyes. I think it's terribly important.
And part of your argument is that Bush is right to say that fostering freedom abroad should be central to our foreign policy, but it's not what his foreign policy is really essentially about, right?
I think that Bush and the Republican Party are wholly insincere about promoting democracy. And what I raise that concern with in the book is that just because Bush says it doesn't mean that we should automatically assume the opposite position. And I think there's a tendency, because what Bush is doing is so awful and so dangerous, there's an instinctual desire to say whatever he's doing, we want to do the opposite of it. Let's just identify what he is actually doing. He is not actually promoting democracy. He's not promoting any sort of credible democracy anywhere. And the evidence of that is tenfold. Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Libya, the attempted coup of Haiti, the actual coup in Haiti, the attempted coup of Venezuela. It goes on and on.
I mean, we should be clear. He didn't try to stage a coup in Venezuela, but he approved of it. It was a domestic coup, but he approved of it during that brief phase when it seemed to have been successful.
Right.
He expressed his approval of that form of changing a government.
Absolutely. And,
right.
And they still try to undermine. I mean, not that Hugo Chavez is necessarily a saint by any stretch, but he is democratically elected,
right,
and should be treated as such.
Yeah. Now, and you're right. I mean, to point to the sheer hypocrisy. I mean, the Bush's rhetorical support for freedom is so sweeping that when you look at what he's actually doing with authoritarian regimes, there is a certain contradiction there. On the other hand, I would say that as a practical matter, I mean, if you were in the position of actually governing, you would have some tough choices to make, and I'm not sure what I would do in all cases. I mean, there are. I mean, let's suppose I don't really know what Pakistan is doing with respect to al-Qaeda, but suppose, as a thought experiment, you had a somewhat authoritarian government in Pakistan, which you have, that actually was doing various things that are useful to you, at least in the short run. They were helping you fight al-Qaeda. Suppose they were helping to suppress the Taliban. Suppose they were doing those things. And further, there was the distinct prospect that if there was a democratic election, the initial government, might not be exactly to your liking, might be much less cooperative, might conceivably in some countries even be a quite radical regime. What do you do as president in that situation?
Well, when I talk in the book about how do you promote credible democracy, I'll talk about this in the big picture first, then I can talk more specifically about Pakistan. It's a difficult thing to want to promote something that is inherently about other people choosing their own government. If you're imposing a government on them, it's not a credible democracy anymore. So how can we, as an outside force, promote that? What I argue is there's a four-prong strategy for that. One is to work internationally, build strong alliances and coalitions, so our actions abroad are not seen and are in actuality out of narrow self-interest, like trying to claim natural resources for ourselves, but clearly in an altruistic approach. Secondly, don't play favorites when you engage in countries abroad. Whatever the country is, whether it's currently a democracy or currently an autocratic government, talk to all parties in that country, the ruling powers and the opposition parties. If you're picking and choosing a favorite, you're no longer seen as a force for credible democracy. You're seen as trying to install a favorable government to yourself. Thirdly, practice what you preach when it comes to human rights. Because when there is a government that might be less friendly to us, we at least want there to be high international standards that everybody largely follows. And those treaties are established by the UN, but when we don't abide by those that we've ratified ourselves, we can't be a force for good elsewhere. And finally, you have to be relentless on nuclear proliferation, because once a country gets a nuke, they become all that much harder to pressure to adopt democratic reforms because they got a trump card on you.
But if faced with the choice where a democratic election will almost surely usher in, say, a radical regime, a radical anti-American regime, say Muslim fundamentalists or something, you would accept that?
Well, let's take an actual example right now. Look at the Palestinian Authority. Here's a case where a terrorist organization won the election in Hamas. But once they won, everything that Bush himself said could happen through democracy, the moderation of Islam, began to happen. And in fact, there is now a split in Hamas where the folks that were elected in Palestine have been making some motions to implicitly recognize Israel, whereas the folks who are in Hamas outside of the area, the exiles in Syria, are the ones that have maintained their radical posture and have been doing the abductions and other belligerent acts. But when that development happened, when you saw democracy in the Palestinian Authority actually bring the moderation that we talk about, you did not see George Bush actually foster that. They encouraged Israel to engage in a belligerent response, which decimated any hope of any progress there.
Well, and in fact, I mean, they stated that policy before the election even ended. I mean, they said either before then or right after that, we're going to cut off funding to Hamas. Not just international aid to Hamas, but Israel actually intercepts tax receipts that legitimately belong to the Palestinian people. Now, that was my line on Hamas, was that I am cynical enough to think that you can significantly and even radically change the behavior of even radicals if you change the incentive structure. Not in all cases. You can point to people who are incorrigible, but the truth is that right after that election, if you look closely at what high-ranking people in Hamas were saying, first of all, they weren't all saying the same thing. It wasn't that unified, but a number of them were throwing out little kind of overtures in terms of what they weren't saying, which is we will never accept the existence of the state of Israel, and I just think that was a massive missed opportunity, and so I agree with you on that, especially in that case. And in general, I guess my philosophy is you live with the consequences of democratic change and work at moderating the behavior of whoever you wind up with. And I think also now's the time when we can afford to do that, because it's not like any of them are going to have nukes like right now. It seems to me like right now is the time to let the transitions happen and then let the ensuing moderation take hold if you can indeed guide that process. But it's a tough, in real time, if I were president, I know there would be a lot of tough trade-offs.
Well, these are difficult trouble spots. I mean, certainly Israel, Palestine is, Lebanon is, Iran is, Pakistan is. But I think if your underlying objective is true credible democracy, and it's clear across the world that is the case, I think you have a lot more cards to play in dealing with these trouble spots than you do when your overt foreign policy is, unilateralist, belligerent, and clearly trying to exert, illegitimate influence across a hostile region. Yeah.
No, that I think makes sense, and it kind of gets at a hobby horse of mine, which is more than ever the world's opinion of us, grassroots opinion. Shapes our national security. I mean, more and more our safety is dependent on people, by and large, around the world thinking well of us, because more and more the threat to our national security is actually grassroots-based terrorism. And that leads to... I buy the idea of trying to set a high kind of standard and live by it. And make it as express it in general terms and abide by those terms. But it leads to a kind of challenge that I think Democrats face, which is just that when you have terrorists out there who are in some sense the enemy, the most deeply instinctive human response to enemies is to fight them, and that's what the Bush administration has tended to do in various ways, some of them well-advised, and I think some of them, like the Iraq War, not so well-advised. For one thing, the Iraqi regime those weren't really the terrorists. But I think a subtler understanding of the problem leads you to believe that actually, fostering a favorable climate of world opinion toward America is very important. But as a message, as a democratic message, don't you agree that's a little harder to sell than just we will kill terrorists wherever we find them?
I think any foreign policy message for Democrats to sell is going to be difficult and is not necessarily going to pay off in the short run, because there is a longstanding perception, false in my opinion, but a perception that's out there, that Republicans are strong on national security and Democrats are weak. And there is no way to talk yourself out of that. You only can show your way out of that. And you have to be in the chair. You either have to prosecute a successful war like FDR did with World War II, or you have to successfully avert war in a way that keeps us strong, like JFK with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Unless you're doing something like that, you can talk tough all day long, you can poll test all your buzzwords, it's not going to matter. Now, the only way that we might get the opportunity to show our mettle is if the public decides, A, foreign policy is not my primary concern right now, and I trust Democrats on domestic issues more, or B, I'm so sick and tired of what the Republicans are doing with foreign policy. None of what they've said has worked out. I'll give the other guy a shot and see how it goes. We might be at that point very soon in 2008. So what I would argue as far as how do you sell it, don't think about it in terms of what's going to politically pay off today. Think about what are the basic principles, the basic objectives that we want to achieve globally, and talk about those consistently. Build up a level of trust about it, so when that moment comes, the public says, you know what, I want to give this other team a look over, there's a sense that you have a game plan and a direction ready to go.
Yeah. But I would like to see a candidate kind of address the issue. And I think actually you talk about this in your book. Here's a quote from your book. It has always been difficult for liberals to make the connection between how we are perceived abroad and how safe we are at home. Putting too much emphasis on how badly we want other countries to like us can come across as unprincipled, desperate, and weak. I think that is a problem. That if John Kerry had come out and said, Bush has created a world in which we're not well liked, he risks being dismissed, as a kind of sissy and failing to heed Machiavelli's, dictum that it's better to be feared than loved or whatever. At the same time, and I actually wrote an op-ed about this shortly after he was nominated, I think he should have tackled the rhetorical challenge of explaining what is so dangerous about Bush's foreign policy, which brings you inevitably into touch with this basic idea that it matters what people think of us. But there are ways of talking about it that I think are more effective than others. I mean, at one point in his nomination acceptance speech, he used the word respect. America needs to be respected abroad. And saying that is very different from saying America needs to be liked. Mm-hmm. And it sounds more, masculine and yet it captures, the dynamics of the issue in a pretty subtle way. Respect is exactly what we need, and respect does flow from strength to some extent, but it also flows from a lot of other things, like moral consistency. And I actually think you're a little easy on Kerry in the chapter I read. I think he showed a lack of courage, you might say kind of a lack of manhood in failing to argue that foreign policy isn't just about manhood. I mean, you can point to the quote here and there, but I was really paying attention and really eager for him to make this case in a forceful way and repeat it, and he just didn't. He just kept saying things like, we'll kill the terrorists wherever we find them. Well, if Bush is already doing that, why should we elect you? I thought he had to really convey what was wrong with Bush's foreign policy, and I don't think he was courageous enough to do it. Well, as you can see, Bill is powerless to respond to my argument, either because the argument itself is so forceful or because he just lost his audio. Turns out that that's what happened. He lost his audio. We actually talked for another half hour, had a very nice conversation. But if we played that half hour for you, I'm the only one that you would hear making any actual sounds. And that's a bit too much of me, even for my taste. So we'll spare you that. We'll have to have Bill on again in a few weeks after his book actually comes out. Meanwhile, Mickey and I should have a dialogue up not long after Monday midnight in the wee hours of Tuesday, September 12th. And we'll see you then.